Und links von mir am Strand saß mein physischer Körper.
On the left of me on the beach sat my physical body. I was outside of my body and had a kind of energetic or light body. And next to my sitting physical body was the physical body of my husband. And from this perspective, I perceived him in his light body. And I remember my first thought was, "Ah, there you are. I was worried about you." Because I saw that he was obviously doing well. We were able to say goodbye to each other on this level.
Wie noch voneinander verabschieden.
Frau Friedrich, im Jahr 2012, während Ihrer Flitterwochen in Kolumbien...
Miss Friedrich, in 2012, during your honeymoon in Colombia, you had to witness your husband drowning in the sea. This tragic event led to a special experience for you, which today is known as a shared death experience. This experience gave you a deeper insight into the significance of this event. I would like to talk to you about this. But first, I would like to ask you to describe how this accident came about. How did you experience it?
Ja, das war im 2012.
Yes, that was in 2012. We were newly married with my then husband, and we decided to spend our honeymoon in Colombia in the Caribbean. And on one part of the trip, there was also a mutual friend with us. We were on the coast in a national park. We walked to a beach, and it was relatively remote. You had to walk to this beach. And when we got there, we wanted to freshen up a bit. There were also bungalows where you could spend the night. And we had also inquired beforehand if it was possible to swim there. And they said yes, just don't swim out too far. And then we went to the water. It was a bit choppy that day. The sea was already a bit choppy, but we thought if we just stand in the water and don't really swim out, then it's okay. But we didn't know that there was an undercurrent at that point. And I don't think there was really a way to know that. And then we went into the water, just hip high into the sea. And then a wave came. We jumped up so that it didn't splash in our face like you often do when you swim in the sea. But what happened was that this current started to pull us out. I don't know how it was for the others, but I didn't notice it at all. Every time I jumped up, I only noticed it when I came down, when suddenly there was no more ground under my feet. And then I turned around and saw that the beach was already quite far away. And I tried to swim back, but it just didn't work. And at that moment, I got really scared. At that moment, I really thought I was afraid to die. I really thought my last hour had struck. And I tried to swim and swim, and I couldn't move forward, and the current pulled us even further out. And even further out, the waves were really high. They really crashed over us.
Did you see that this was happening to everyone?
To me and my husband. He was very close to me, and our friend was still at the shore, and I started to cry for help.
And
in that moment, my husband turned around to me. He was about 5 meters away from me, and I saw panic in his eyes. And at that moment, I understood that he couldn't help me, that he was in exactly the same situation as I was. And he also started to scream for help. And the only thing that came to my mind at that moment was to pray. To pray for some form of support. I wasn't a religious person, and I still am not a religious person, but at that moment I thought that if there is anything bigger, then now would be a good time for it to show itself. And at that moment, 2 words were suddenly present: trust and surrender. And it's very difficult to explain that in words, but those 2 words were so clear in my mind. I suddenly became very calm. And I tried to transfer these words to the situation. And I thought to myself, okay, I have to trust the sea. I have to surrender to the sea. And at that moment, I understood that I can't fight against the sea, that the sea is much bigger and much stronger than me, and that I'm swimming wrong. And then I changed my swimming technique and just waited for the wave. And when the next wave crashed over me, I just swam with the force of this wave as far as I could.
In the sense of the term surrender.
And I really used this greater force. And when the wave pulled back again, I just stayed on the surface and waited. Because you don't move forward in that moment. You just waste all your energy. So I waited for the next wave and swam again with the next wave. And then I noticed that I was moving forward this way. And I swam to my husband and wanted to help him. But when I got to him, he was already panicking. He was waving his arms around, and I heard him swallowing water. And I couldn't calm him down. So I swam to him from behind and put my hand on his shoulder. But we couldn't really talk to each other. It was so loud in the waves. And yes, it didn't really work. And our friend heard our calls for help and swam out to help us. And he was already very close. And in that moment, I made the decision to try to get to shore, so that he only needed to take care of one person. And then I swam on with the next wave, waited again, swam on again, waited again, and that's how I managed to get back to the beach. And I think I will never forget the moment when my feet touched the ground again. Then I got out of the water and looked back and saw that the 2 of them were still out there. And there was no one else on the beach, so we were all alone. Back at the bungalows, there were a few other tourists and the people who run the bungalows, and I ran off to get help. And then I came back to the beach with more people. But there was nothing to do. There was nothing on the beach. There was no boat, no surfboard, nothing that could have been used for help. And And in the meantime, our friend had arrived at where my husband was. But when he got to him, my husband had already lost consciousness. So he tried to swim back with him, tried to take him in the swimmer's grip and swim back. But that was impossible. Every wave had torn him apart again, and you couldn't get out of this current on your own. It just didn't work with someone in tow. And then at some point he had to decide. Either I let go, or I drown with him. And luckily he let go. And he made it back. But that was one of the most challenging moments, because we were now several people on the beach, and we were totally helpless as to what could be done in this situation. And every now and then I saw my husband's body somewhere in the waves. And the dynamics of the sea brought him a little closer at some point. Then 2 Argentinian tourists went in together. And together they managed to get him out. I remember at that moment I was so relieved. At that moment, I thought, they did it, they saved him. And they carried him to the beach, but he didn't breathe anymore, and he didn't have a pulse anymore. Then we tried to revive him. Someone started mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and a heart massage. And when they turned him to the side to pump out the water, I opened his mouth so he could breathe. And at some point, I don't know how long it was, but at some point, I noticed that his jaw was getting hard. And at that moment, I understood that we couldn't get him back. And that the only thing that could make any difference would maybe be a miracle. At that moment, I called for help from the bottom of my heart, internally. And then I suddenly noticed a presence on the beach to my right. To my right on the beach, there was a... Now the part where the words fail starts. How to describe it, but there was a... I call it a light being. There was a being of bright, golden, warm light that I perceived more like a silhouette. Maybe that's what many people call angels. I don't know. And I remember seeing this light being, and inside I said to him, "Why are you standing there so stupidly? Do something." And it gave me an understanding that it can't intervene. And I don't know exactly how to describe this communication. It was like communicating in thoughts.
Simply a knowing.
Yes, exactly. And after that, I received a very big gift for me and for my further path. I suddenly saw the life of my husband. From the moment of his birth to this moment on the beach. And it's often described as a film, but for me it wasn't a film. It was more like all the information at once. And after that, I saw my life, from the moment of my birth to this moment.
This panorama of life, were there details of your husband's life that weren't known to you, that gave you a new insight into his life?
I don't know exactly. I don't know the details anymore. But what is still very, very present is that in both lives I saw this moment on the beach. And I think that's what it was about. That's why it was shown to me. I saw this moment on the beach in both lives. And you can't really explain that rationally. But on a different level, on a spiritual or mental level, it made sense in that moment. I saw this moment in both our lives, and it was like, ah, okay, that's how it is. And at that moment, I understood that it was his time to go. And at that moment, on a spiritual level, I was able to accept that. I was able to say, yes, okay, it's good that way. Then I asked the light being if I could also go. And it denied and said that it wasn't my time yet, that I still had a task. And then I also accepted that. And then, I don't know exactly how to describe it, but then there was a moment where a kind of letting go took place in me. Although that actually conveys far too little. But everything that was important to me up to that point, everything I had built my life around, all the things you hold on to and identify with, they didn't have any meaning at that moment. It just collapsed. I mean, the life I'd wished for. I mean, we had just gotten married. It just collapsed like a house of cards. And in that letting go, I was allowed to accompany my husband in a way. And what I find particularly difficult to describe is that there are several experiences. And if I were to tell it now, I would have to bring in a chronological order. But it was more like a life that took place on different levels at the same time. And there was one level where I was in a light. Well, it was not really a light, but it was a place in a light, in a state of being, in a golden warm light. And there was so much peace and so much love. And I was part of that light. I wasn't separated from it. And I kind of blossomed in that light. And it was like a feeling of being at home. And then there was another level, or another sequence, where I was standing on the beach, and I looked down at myself, and I realized, I have a body of light. And then I saw that on the left of me, on the floor, was my physical body. And next to it was the physical body of my husband. So I was outside my body and had a kind of energetic or light body. And from this perspective, I also saw my husband in his light body. And I remember my first thought was, there you are. I was worried about you. Because then I saw he's doing well. And at the same time, I realized that he was also worried about me and about other people he left behind. And we were able to say goodbye to each other on this level.
So to you there was a real exchange happening.
Yes, there was a real exchange. And something that was also very exciting was that before this experience, there were also various signs. I also had a very strong inner premonition that something, a big change would come in my life.
Even before the journey?
Yes, but I couldn't process it at all. And I also encouraged him to go on his way, wherever that leads. And I promised him that I would find a way for me to deal with it and to live on. I encouraged him to go into the light, or whatever you want to call it.
Did you also have an impression of how he felt in this situation?
Yes, I saw, well, at first there was a moment when I noticed that he was also worried about me and about the people he left behind. But then I noticed that in this exchange, in this conversation, there was also more calm and more peace in him. And from this level, I then came back into the body. And that was actually one of the most challenging moments. Because I was back in the physical body. And I was torn back and forth all the time between totally opposite emotional states. On the one hand, there was a feeling of peace. And I was so touched by this experience that I had just had. And all the insights that were associated with it. And that I had seen my husband outside of his physical body, and that I now knew with certainty, through experience, that I also have an existence outside of my physical body. There was a level where I was in really deep peace and a really deep acceptance. And then there was a totally different level where I just sat on this beach as a human being, as a woman, and held the hand of this dead body, and inside I just screamed, "No, come back, come back." So it always threw me back and forth between a deep despair and a state of inner peace and inner calm. It was very challenging to get back into the body and into this polarity. I then took more time on the beach to really say goodbye and really spend time with the body of my husband. And then we were evacuated by a military helicopter. I was in Colombia for another week. There's a lot that you have to do afterwards. There were witness statements at the police, an autopsy, and I had the body cremated so that I could take the urn back to Switzerland. There was a lot of that had to be done. At the same time, I was in a constant flow state. Everything just kind of fit together. And me and our mutual friend received support from the most unexpected places. The Colombian military, for example, ordered a soldier to take care of us and to drive us from A to B to C by car and to organize a hotel.
So really good support with everything.
Yes, really, really very, very important support. And we also received very important support from the police. In this really, really painful and difficult time, there was also a level that felt totally guided.
There is a topic that I would also like to address. You said that you are not religiously oriented. In view of how you yourself reacted in the sea and what you then experienced with a shared death experience, would you say that you were somehow prepared for these events?
Yes, I would say so. I had a very, very strong premonition that a great change would take place in my life. And I couldn't process it at all. It also really scared me beforehand. The feeling was like life as I knew it would end. It was a very strong feeling. And I couldn't process it at all. But in retrospect, I interpreted it as a kind of preparation. And what was also interesting, where we lived in Bolivia at the time, and very close to the house where we lived, there was a meditation center. I walked past it every day and was somehow curious what they were doing there. And then I went in there and started to meditate once or twice a week with this meditation group. That was 1.5 years before it started. And also in those months, in those 3 months before the event, where this feeling was so strong and really scared me in meditation, I often tried to feel into this feeling and to find out what it was exactly and whether it wanted to tell me something. And the only thing that came up were these 2 words, trust and surrender.
So even before?
They came before, yes. They came before in meditation as a constant loop. And I think that was also what helped me to make this shift in the sea. From a state where I was about to fall into a state of panic, to a state where I realized, okay, I'm going to let go now and hand it over to something bigger.
Was this topic of letting go, or the events in any way, also a topic in a conversation with your husband?
No. I did tell him how I felt at the time, but no.
I became aware of your story through William Peters, a thanatologist who, in the context of a large project entitled Shared Crossing, deals with shared death experiences. Do you have the impression that this topic of shared death experiences, which has been a subject of interest in the English-speaking world for a long time, also through Raymond Moody, is now slowly coming to us, to the German-speaking world? Do you know people with similar experiences?
I think the topic is only slowly coming to us. I know of people with similar experiences. I don't have any personal contacts, but it helped me a lot when I realized, there is a name for it, and there are thousands of people who have had similar experiences. I knew at the time that there were near-death experiences, but that was a big question for me after this experience. What was that? What did I actually experience? Because in terms of the content or the experience, it is very comparable to a near-death experience. And at the same time, I was not dying at that moment. and that was really very special. The question was very present, and Raymond Moody, who introduced this term in his book on shared death experiences, published his book in 2011. I had my experience in 2012. Interestingly, someone handed me his book in 2012. For me, it was like, oh, yes, exactly.
So it was clear to you fairly quickly what you had experienced.
Yes. It became clear fairly quickly, exactly. And currently, William Peters has continued this research. And his book is now also available in German. I hope that this term will become more established also in the German-speaking world. Because personally, it helped me a lot to just realize that there are many, many other people who have similar experiences to mine. And there is scientific research on it.
Ms. Friedrich, thank you very much for your openness. All the best going forward, and thank you for the conversation.
Yes, thank you for the interview.